Where did you get that wallet?
It's my mama's wallet,
It's
sir.
my mama's wallet,
But
sir.
is something wrong?
But is something wrong?
The girl asked softly. She slipped the wallet back into her coat pocket and turned to the register again.
That's everything.
The cashier finished ringing up her milk, crackers, and a loaf of cheap white bread. Behind her, Ethan Cole stood waiting with a bottle of water in his hand, but his attention was no longer on his place in line. When she opened the wallet again to take out more coins, a few slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. "Oh, sorry," she murmured, quickly bending down to pick them up. In her hurry, she left the wallet on the counter. Ethan reached out so it wouldn't slide off the edge. He picked it up just as she straightened, and he immediately placed it back into her hand. "Here," he said, "you almost left it." "Thank you, sir." The cashier had been watching the whole time. He looked at Ethan with narrowed eyes. "You got some business with that child's wallet?" he asked bluntly. Ethan shook his head calmly. "No, it just looks very familiar. I thought I recognized it." The cashier studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small shrug and turned back to the register. The girl tucked the wallet close against herself, still looking at Ethan with quiet curiosity now. "Excuse me," Ethan said gently. "Would you mind stepping over to the side for a moment? I'd like to ask you something about that wallet." She hesitated, then picked up her small bag and stepped with him toward the front window. "What do you want to know?" she asked. Ethan nodded toward the wallet. "You said it belongs to your mother. Do you know where she got it?" "Yes," the girl said. "Her brother gave it to her. A long time ago." Ethan felt his chest tighten slightly. "Her brother?" She nodded. "They got separated when they were young. Mama said they didn't lose each other because they wanted to. They just couldn't find each other again." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Did she keep anything else from him?" The girl shook her head. "Just this wallet. And the picture inside." Ethan looked at the wallet in her hands. "May I see the picture?" he asked gently. I think I might know it." She studied his face for a long second, then slowly handed him the wallet. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside, behind the old plastic sleeve, was the photograph he remembered: a man seated in a chair, a serious boy standing beside him, and a little black girl smiling at the camera. Ethan went completely still. He closed the wallet slowly and handed it back to her, his hand slightly unsteady now. Then he looked at her and asked quietly, "Is your mother's name Marissa?" The girl's eyes widened. "Yes." "How do you know my mama?" Ethan swallowed, then spoke in a calm, steady voice, though his eyes had changed. "Because," he said, "I knew her when she was a little girl. We grew up together." The girl stared at him, not fully understanding yet. Ethan took a slow breath, then said the words he never thought he would say to a stranger in a small convenience store. I think I'm the brother your mother lost." He paused, then added gently, "I'm her older brother." The girl didn't speak. She just looked at him, searching his face, trying to decide whether this was impossible or simply something she had never imagined could happen. Ethan did not move closer. He did not reach for the wallet again. He simply stood there and said, very softly, "Can you take me to her?" Ethan did not realize he had been holding his breath until the girl tightened her grip on the paper bag and looked toward the door, then back at him again. "You said, you're my mama's brother?" she asked slowly. "I believe so," Ethan replied. He kept his voice calm, careful not to rush her. "I know this sounds sudden, but the picture in that wallet, I was in that picture. And your mother was there too. We were children then." The girl searched his face, not with fear, but with the serious attention of a child trying to decide whether an adult was telling the truth. "My mama said her brother was tall," she said after a moment, "and quiet, and that he used to read books instead of playing outside." Ethan let out a small breath that almost turned into a laugh. "That sounds like me." She shifted the bag in her arms. "Mama said she lost him when they moved away. She said she looked for him later, but she didn't know where to look. I looked too," Ethan said quietly. "But I didn't know where to find her either." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the store returned around them, the register closing. Finally, the girl asked, "If you're really her brother, why didn't you come before?" Ethan did not try to invent an easy answer. "Because when we were separated, I was still a kid, and by the time I was old enough to look for her myself, Too many years had passed and too many addresses had changed. I didn't know where to start. That's the truth. She watched him carefully, then gave a small nod as if she had decided that answer sounded like something her mother would believe. Can you take me to her? Ethan asked again, more gently this time. The girl hesitated. She's home. Is it far? She shook her head. We walk. Ethan glanced down at her thin coat, then at the darkening sky outside the window. Then let me walk with you. They stepped outside together. The cold air hit immediately, sharp and dry. The sky had already turned that deep winter blue that came just before full dark. Cars passed now and then, their headlights sliding over the sidewalk and disappearing again. The girl walked a few steps ahead at first, then slowed so he could walk beside her. What's your name? She asked. Ethan, he said. She repeated it quietly, as if committing it to memory. Mama's brother is named Ethan. He nodded once. Yes. They walked past a laundromat with bright lights and spinning machines, past a closed barber shop, past a small church with a wooden sign out front. Did you really read books all the time? She asked after a while. Ethan glanced down at her, surprised. I did. Your mother used to get mad because I wouldn't play outside long enough. The girl smiled a little. Mama still gets mad when I read too long. He felt something warm and painful move through his chest at the same time. That sounds like her. They walked another block in silence. Then she spoke again. Mama kept that wallet in a box for a long time, she said. She only started carrying it again this year. Did she say why? Ethan asked. She said if she ever met her brother again, she wanted to have the picture with her. If this story touched your heart in any way, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I read every single comment, and your stories mean more than you know. And if you believe stories about family, second chances, and quiet courage still matter, please subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the next story. Ethan stopped walking for half a second, then started again, slower now. They turned down a narrower street lined with older apartment buildings. Paint peeled from some of the railings, and a few porch lights flickered on as the evening deepened. The girl walked straight to one of the buildings and climbed the short set of steps without hesitation. She turned back to him at the top. She's here. Ethan stood at the bottom of the steps for a moment, looking up at the door. But standing at the bottom of those steps, he felt something he had not felt in years. He walked up the steps slowly. The girl opened the door and stepped inside, then looked back to make sure he was following. The hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and cooking from different apartments. She led him to a door near the end, and stopped. She looked up at him once more. If you're really her brother, she said quietly. She's going to cry. Ethan nodded. I know. The girl pushed the door open and stepped inside. Mama? She called. I'm home. Ethan remained just outside the doorway, suddenly unsure whether to step in or wait. He could hear movement inside, a chair shifting, footsteps crossing the floor. Then a woman's voice came from inside. You're back already? The girl looked over her shoulder at Ethan, then back into the apartment. Mama, she said, there's someone here who says he knows you. There was a brief pause. Who? The girl stepped aside and looked directly at Ethan, as if this was the moment he had to decide whether he truly meant what he had said in the store. Ethan placed one hand lightly on the doorframe and spoke into the apartment, his voice steady but quieter than usual. Marissa, he said. It's Ethan. Marissa, he said. It's Ethan. For a moment, nothing happened. Ethan stood just inside the doorway now, his hand still resting lightly against the frame. The apartment was small but neat, the kind of place where everything had a place because there was no room for things that didn't matter. A lamp glowed in the corner beside a worn sofa. A small table stood near the kitchen with 2 chairs. On the wall above it hung a calendar, a few notes pinned beside it, and a child's drawing done in bright crayons. Footsteps stopped somewhere inside the apartment. Then a woman stepped into view. She stopped the moment she saw him. They stared at each other across the small living room, both of them frozen in the strange stillness that comes when the past suddenly stands in front of you in the present, breathing, real, and older than you remember. Marissa looked different, of course. Time had touched her face in quiet ways around the eyes, in the set of her mouth, in the way she held her shoulders. But Ethan recognized her immediately, not because of one feature, but because of something deeper. Something in the way she looked at him now. as if she were searching for the boy she used to know, inside the man standing in her doorway. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The girl looked from one to the other, unsure whether to smile or stay quiet. Marissa was the first to find her voice. "Annie," she said slowly, not taking her eyes off Ethan. "Who is this?" Annie stepped closer to her mother. "He said his name is Ethan," she said. "He said he's your brother." Marissa's hand moved slightly, as if she needed to steady herself on the back of the chair beside her. She looked at Ethan again, more carefully this time, studying his face the way people do when they are afraid to believe something but cannot look away. "You," she said quietly. "You look like him." Ethan nodded once. "I know. You look like Dad," she added. "I know that too." The room fell quiet again. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Marissa took a few slow steps closer, her eyes never leaving his face. "Say something," she said. Something only he would know. Ethan understood. She needed proof that was not a photograph, not a wallet, not a coincidence. She needed something that belonged only to the two of them. He thought for only a second. "You used to hide your library books under your pillow," he said, "because you were afraid Dad would say you were reading too late. And when I found out, I started knocking on the wall between our rooms so you'd know when he was coming down the hallway." Marissa's hand flew to her mouth. Ethan continued, his voice quieter now. "And you hated peas. You used to feed them to the dog under the table, and Dad pretended he didn't see because he knew you'd eaten everything else." A sound escaped her, then not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. "And," Ethan said, "you used to call me Professor because I always had a book with me." Marissa stared at him for one long, trembling second. Then she crossed the room in 3 quick steps and threw her arms around him. Ethan held her just as tightly. For a moment, they were no longer two adults standing in a small apartment after years apart. They were children again in a backyard in summer, brother and sister who had once believed they would grow up in the same house, in the same life, never imagining how easily the world could separate people who loved each other. Marissa pulled back first, her eyes wet now. She looked at his face again, as if making sure he wouldn't disappear if she blinked. "You're really here," she said. "Yes. I looked for you," she said. "I tried, but we moved again, and then everything changed, and I didn't know where to write or who to call." "I looked too," Ethan said, "but I didn't know where to start." She shook her head slightly, as if trying to understand how so many years could be lost so quietly. "All this time," she whispered. "All this time, and you were out there somewhere." Ethan glanced around the small apartment, then back at her. "And you were here?" Annie stood a few steps away, watching them with wide, uncertain eyes. She had never seen her mother look like this before, like someone who had just found something she thought she had lost forever. Marissa reached out and pulled Annie closer. "This is my daughter," she said, her voice still unsteady. "Annie." Ethan nodded. "We met at the store." Annie looked up at her mother. "I told you the wallet was important," she said. "I told you somebody might recognize it someday." Marissa let out a small, tearful laugh. "I kept that wallet for so many years," she said to Ethan. "I don't even know why I carried it with me everywhere. I think I was afraid if I put it away, it would mean I had given up." "I'm glad you didn't," Ethan said. She looked at him again, and this time there was something like relief in her expression, mixed with disbelief, and 100 questions that had nowhere to begin. "Sit down," she said quickly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "You shouldn't be standing in the doorway like a stranger. Sit down." Ethan stepped further into the apartment and sat in the chair she pointed to. Annie sat beside her mother on the sofa, still watching him carefully, as if she were trying to match the man in front of her with the stories she had heard all her life. Marissa sat across from him. For a moment, she just looked at him and shook her head slightly. "You look so different," she said. "But your eyes are the same." "You look different too," he said. "But I knew you the second I saw the picture." She smiled faintly. "I kept that picture because it was the last time we were all together." Ethan nodded slowly. "I remember that day." They were quiet for a moment, both of them standing in the same memory without needing to describe it. Finally, Marissa asked the question that had been waiting since he walked through the door. "Where have you been all these years, Ethan?" He leaned back slightly in the chair, not trying to make the answer sound better than it was. Working, building a business, moving from one city to another. I kept thinking I would find you once things settled down. But things never really settle the way you expect them to. She nodded, as if she understood that better than most people. Annie looked from her mother to Ethan. Mama talked about you, she said. She said you used to read to her when the power went out. Ethan smiled a little. That's true. We used to sit by the window with a flashlight. Marissa laughed softly through the last of her tears. You always did the voices when you read. You made every character sound different. I was very serious about my storytelling, Ethan said. Annie studied him for a long moment, then asked the question that mattered most to her, the question that children always ask when they sense something important is happening. So, does this mean you're really my uncle? Ethan looked at her, then at Marissa, then back at the girl. Yes, he said gently. That's exactly what it means. Marissa kept looking at Ethan, as if she were afraid that if she looked away too long, he might disappear again. Annie had moved closer to her, sitting with both hands wrapped around the old wallet, as if she now understood that the small, worn object had just changed something very big in their lives. You're really my uncle, Annie said again, as if testing how the words felt when spoken out loud. Ethan nodded. Yes. She studied him for another moment. Mama said you were tall, she said. She was right. Marissa laughed softly and wiped her eyes again. I told you I didn't make him up. Ethan looked around the apartment once more, this time more carefully. The place was small but tidy. A folded blanket rested on the arm of the sofa. A stack of school books sat on the table. There were a few drawings taped to the wall, houses, trees, a bright yellow sun in the corner of the page. The kind of drawings children made when they believed a house was the most important thing in the world. You've done well, he said quietly to Marissa. She gave a small shrug. We manage. He recognized that tone. Pride. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that refused to ask for help unless there was no other choice. I'm sorry, Ethan said after a moment. She looked at him. For what? For losing you, he said. For all the years in between. Marissa shook her head slowly. You didn't lose me. We were kids. None of it was in our hands. I should have found you sooner. I should have found you too, she replied. Then she gave a small, sad smile. But life keeps moving while you're trying to figure out where to start. Annie looked between them, listening carefully, trying to piece together a story that had begun long before she was born. Mama, she said, tell him about the wallet. Marissa looked down at the old leather billfold in Annie's hands and smiled faintly. Your grandfather carried that wallet for years, she said. After he passed, Ethan gave it to me. I was so proud of it. It was the first grown-up thing anyone ever gave me. Ethan nodded slowly. You said you were going to keep important things in it. I did, she said. At first it was just that photo. Later, it was bus tickets, old addresses, a few letters I never sent. Every time we moved, I told myself I'd find you when things were better. But things were always busy, or expensive, or complicated, and then more time passed, and I didn't know if you even remembered me. I remembered, Ethan said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing those words. Annie opened the wallet and carefully looked at the photograph again. You were both so little, she said. Mama, you look like me. You do, Marissa said, smiling. Annie looked at Ethan in the picture. You look serious. I was a very serious child, Ethan said. Marissa laughed softly. He really was. The room grew quiet again, but this time it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that comes when people are slowly getting used to the idea that something lost has been found. After a while, Ethan said, You shouldn't be here alone, Marissa. She frowned slightly. What do you mean? I mean, he said carefully, we spent too many years not knowing where the other one was. I don't want that to happen again. She understood what he was saying, but she also understood what he was not saying yet. Ethan, she said gently, this is our home. I know, he said. And I'm not trying to take that away from you. Annie watched them both, very quiet now. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together. I have a house, he said. It's too big for one person. I've been living there alone for years, telling myself I liked the quiet. But the truth is, It's just been empty. Marissa didn't respond right away. I'm not asking for an answer tonight, he continued. I just want you to know that you and Annie don't have to do everything alone anymore. You're my family, both of you, and I would like the chance to be part of your lives again. Annie looked up at her mother quickly when she heard that. Marissa looked down at her hands. You don't even know us anymore, she said quietly. I know enough, Ethan replied. I know you kept that wallet all these years. I know you told your daughter about your brother. And I know that when I walked through that door tonight, you didn't ask me for anything. That tells me everything I need to know about you. She was silent for a long moment. Annie spoke first. Mama, she said softly, he found us. Marissa closed her eyes briefly, as if those words had gone straight to her heart. When she opened them again, she looked at Ethan. I don't want to be a burden, she said. You're not, he answered immediately. You're my sister. The word hung in the room. Sister. It sounded both new and very old at the same time. Annie slid off the sofa and walked over to Ethan. She stood in front of him, looking at him with open curiosity now instead of caution. So you're really staying? She asked. Ethan smiled slightly. If you'll let me. She thought about that, then nodded once. Okay. Marissa watched the two of them, something soft and uncertain moving through her expression. She decides things very quickly, she said. I used to do the same thing, Ethan replied. You were always the careful one. I was the one who jumped first and figured it out later. That's still true, it seems, Marissa said. Ethan stood slowly. I should go for tonight, he said. You've had enough surprises for one day. Annie looked disappointed but tried not to show it too much. Will you come back? Yes, he said. I will. He walked to the door, then paused and turned back to Marissa. I meant what I said, he told her quietly. You don't have to do this alone anymore. She looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Okay, she said. It was a small word, but Ethan understood how much it meant. He stepped outside into the cold night air and stood there for a moment on the sidewalk, looking up at the building. A single light glowed from the window of Marissa's apartment. Inside that small apartment were his sister and his niece family he had once lost and somehow found again because of an old wallet and a child who had walked into a store at the right time. For the first time in many years, the night did not feel quite so empty. Inside the apartment, Annie stood by the window watching him walk away. Mama, she said quietly. He looks like he belongs to us. Marissa came to stand beside her and put an arm around her shoulders. Yes, she said softly. He does. The next morning, Ethan woke up earlier than usual. For a few seconds, he lay still in the quiet of his large bedroom, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why something felt different. Then he remembered the small apartment, the old wallet, the photograph, and Marissa standing in front of him after all those years. He sat up slowly. For most of his adult life, Ethan's mornings had followed the same pattern. Coffee, emails, calls, meetings, decisions, everything scheduled, efficient, controlled. But this morning, he did not reach for his phone right away. Instead, he sat there thinking about a small kitchen table, a worn sofa, and a little girl who had looked at him and asked, So you're really staying? He had said yes. Downstairs, the house was as silent as always. The kitchen was spotless, the counters clear, the chairs perfectly aligned as if no one had used them in years. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, looking out over the wide, quiet lawn behind the house. It had taken him 15 years to build this life. The house, the company, the reputation. People called him successful, disciplined, focused. They said he had built something solid. And yet, standing there with a cup of coffee in his hand, the house felt less like an achievement and more like a place that had been waiting for a reason to feel alive. He finished his coffee, picked up his keys, and left earlier than he needed to. On the way, he stopped at a grocery store, not the small one from the night before, but a larger one on the main road. He walked through the aisles slowly, pushing a cart, trying to remember what a child liked to eat. He found himself putting things in the cart almost without thinking. Milk, eggs, bread, peanut butter, jelly, apples, a box of cereal with a bright cartoon bird on the front. Then he paused, looking at the shelves for a long moment before adding pancake mix and a bottle of syrup. He wasn't sure why he chose those things. Maybe because pancakes felt like something that belonged to a family, not to a man eating alone at a long table. When he arrived at Marissa's building, he carried the grocery bags himself. The hallway looked the same as the night before: dim lights, worn carpet, the faint echo of a television playing somewhere behind a closed door. He stood in front of her apartment for a moment before knocking. He heard footsteps, then the door opened. Marissa looked surprised to see him so early. "Ethan, I hope it's not too early," he said. "I was nearby." She glanced at the bags in his hands. "You brought groceries." "Yes," he said simply. "I wasn't sure what you already had, so I just guessed." For a second, she looked like she might protest. He could see the pride rise in her expression, the instinct to say, "You don't have to do that." But then she looked at the bags again, and something in her face softened. "Come in," she said quietly. He stepped inside and set the bags on the kitchen table. Annie appeared from the hallway, her hair slightly messy, as if she had just woken up. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would," Ethan replied. She walked straight to the table and looked into the grocery bags. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw the cereal box. "We don't usually get this kind," she said. "Well," Ethan said, "I figured we could try it." Marissa leaned against the counter, watching the two of them. "You didn't have to bring all this," she said. But there was no sharpness in her voice now. "I know," he replied. "I wanted to." Annie pulled the pancake mix out of the bag. "Do you know how to make pancakes?" she asked. Ethan smiled a little. "I know how to try." "That means no," Marissa said, and for the first time since he had seen her again, she laughed the way she used to when they were young. "I can learn," Ethan said. Annie looked very serious. "Mama makes them on Saturdays." "Then maybe I should come on Saturdays," he said. The words slipped out naturally, but when he said them, the room grew a little quieter. Marissa looked at him for a long moment. "You really mean that?" she said. "Yes," he answered. "I do." Annie poured herself a glass of milk and sat at the table. "Mama," she said, "if he's really our family, does that mean he's going to be here a lot?" Marissa looked at Ethan before answering. "That depends," she said slowly, "on whether he wants to be." Ethan pulled out one of the chairs and sat down across from Annie. "I spent a lot of years not knowing where your mama was," he said. "I don't want to spend any more years like that." Annie nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. Marissa sat down too, folding her hands on the table. "Ethan," she said, "your life is probably very different from ours." "It is," he admitted. "You have a big house, don't you?" Annie asked. "Yes." "Do you live there alone?" "Yes." She thought about that. "That must be very quiet." "It is," he said. Marissa watched him carefully. "Why didn't you ever have a family?" she asked gently. Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair, thinking about the question. "I always thought I would," he said. "But I kept telling myself I was too busy, that I would slow down later, that there was time. And then there wasn't," she said softly. He nodded once. "And then there wasn't." They sat there in silence for a moment, the three of them around a small kitchen table with grocery bags still half unpacked. And Ethan realized that this simple, ordinary moment felt more important than most of the meetings he had attended in the last 10 years. He looked at Marissa. "I meant what I said last night," he told her. "You and Annie are not alone anymore. Whatever you need, I'm here." Marissa held his gaze for a long moment, as if she were measuring not his words, but his intention. Finally, she said quietly, "We don't need much, Ethan. We just need to know you're not going to disappear again." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere." Annie looked between them and smiled slightly, as if she had just decided something important in her own mind. "Good," she said, "because I just found an uncle yesterday, and I don't want to lose him today." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, but this time it wasn't pain. This time, it felt like something that had been empty for a very long time was beginning, slowly, to fill. Ethan stayed longer that morning than he had planned. What he had meant to be a short visit turned into breakfast at the small kitchen table, with Annie carefully pouring cereal into a bowl as if it were something special, and Marissa making coffee while still shaking her head every time she looked at him, as if she still couldn't quite believe he was sitting there. After they ate, Annie gathered her school books from a corner of the room and packed them into her bag. You walk to school? Ethan asked. Yes, she said. It's not far. I'll drive you, he said without thinking. Annie looked at her mother immediately, asking permission without words. Marissa hesitated. You don't have to. I know, Ethan said gently. I want to. Marissa studied his face for a moment, then nodded. Okay. But just today. She usually walks with a group from the next building. That's fine, Ethan said. A few minutes later, the three of them walked out to the street together. Ethan's car was parked along the curb, dark and polished, completely out of place among the older cars lining the block. Annie stopped when she saw it. This is your car? Yes. She walked around it slowly, then looked up at him. It looks important. Ethan smiled slightly. It's just a car. It's a very shiny just a car, Marissa said quietly. They got in, Annie in the back, Marissa in the front. As Ethan drove through the neighborhood, Annie kept looking out the window, then at the dashboard, then out the window again. Do you drive this every day? She asked. Most days. She nodded as if she were trying to imagine what that kind of life looked like. When they stopped in front of the school, Annie unbuckled her seatbelt but didn't open the door right away. She leaned forward between the seats. Will you come back later? She asked. Ethan glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Yes, I'll come back. She seemed satisfied with that. Okay, she said, then climbed out and ran toward the school doors, her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders. Marissa watched her go, then let out a slow breath. She likes you, she said. I like her too, Ethan replied. They sat in the parked car for a moment after Annie disappeared inside. This is strange, Marissa said quietly. Yes, Ethan agreed. It is. She looked out the window. Yesterday, I was just living my life. Going to work, coming home, helping Annie with homework, making dinner, and now you're here, and everything feels different, but also the same. I know what you mean, he said. She turned to look at him. Tell me the truth, Ethan. What is your life like now? He thought about that for a moment before answering. Busy? He said. Structured. Quiet. I work too much. I go to a lot of meetings. I come home to a very clean house. I eat dinner at a table that's too big for one person. Then I do more work. She watched him carefully. Are you happy? It was a simple question, but it took him a moment to answer. I was proud, he said finally. I thought that was the same thing. And now? He looked at the school building, at the doors where Annie had just disappeared. Now I think they're different. Marissa followed his gaze. She's a good kid, she said softly. I can see that. I tried to make sure she always knew she was loved, Marissa continued. Even when things were hard, I wanted her to feel like she belonged somewhere. Ethan nodded slowly. You did a good job. She smiled faintly. I did my best. They drove back to the apartment in a comfortable silence. When they got there, Ethan parked the car but didn't start the engine right away. Marissa, he said, I want you to come see my house. She looked surprised. Why? Because if I'm going to be part of your life again, you should know where I live, and Annie should see it too. Not because it's big or expensive, but because I want you to understand something. What? She asked. That there's space there, he said. More space than I know what to do with. She looked at him for a long moment, understanding what he was really saying but not answering yet. You don't have to decide anything, he added quickly. I just want you to see it. That's all. Marissa looked down at her hands, then back at him. Okay, she said quietly. We can come see it. That afternoon, Ethan came back to pick Annie up from school. When she got into the car, she immediately started talking about her day, about a math test, about a girl in her class who could draw horses perfectly, about how the cafeteria always served the same vegetables on Wednesdays. Ethan listened to all of it, as if it were the most important report he had ever heard. Where are we going? Annie asked when she noticed they were driving in the opposite direction from the apartment. To my house, he said. Her eyes widened. Really? Marissa turned slightly in her seat. He wants to show us where he lives. Annie sat back and looked out the window as the buildings slowly changed. The streets grew wider. The houses grew larger. Trees lined the sidewalks instead of telephone poles. The noise of the city softened into the quiet of a residential neighborhood. When Ethan turned into a long driveway and the gates opened slowly, Annie leaned forward between the seats again, her eyes wide. "You live here?" she whispered. "Yes," he said. The house stood at the top of a small hill, large but not showy, built of stone and glass, with wide windows facing the trees behind it. To Ethan, it had always looked like a well-designed structure. To Annie, it looked like something from a storybook. They got out of the car. Annie stood very close to her mother now, suddenly unsure again. "It's very big," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Yes, it is." He opened the front door and stepped aside so they could enter first. Inside, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from too much space and not enough people. The floors were polished wood, the furniture carefully chosen, the walls decorated with paintings that had been selected by someone with good taste and no emotional attachment to any of them. Annie walked in slowly, looking around as if she were afraid to touch anything. "Do you live here by yourself?" she asked. "Yes." She looked around again, then said something so honest and so simple that it went straight through him. "Then it must be very lonely." Annie's words lingered in the air long after she said them. "Then it must be very lonely." Ethan did not answer right away. He watched her walk slowly across the living room, her small footsteps quiet against the polished wooden floor. She stopped in front of the large windows that looked out over the backyard and pressed her hand lightly against the glass, as if she were trying to feel the space outside. Marissa stood near the door, taking everything in with a different kind of gaze. Annie saw a big house. Marissa saw the life her brother had built without her, room by room, year by year. "I used to think I liked the quiet," Ethan said finally. "I told myself it meant I could think." Annie turned back toward him. "Can't you think if people are there too?" Marissa smiled a little at that, but she didn't interrupt. "I suppose you can," Ethan said. "I just never tried." Annie walked into the next room, where a long dining table stood under a hanging light fixture. She counted the chairs quietly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. She looked back at him. "Why do you have so many chairs if it's just you?" Ethan leaned one shoulder against the doorway. "I bought the table because someone told me it was the right table for the room." "But you don't use all the chairs," she said. "No," he admitted. "I don't." Marissa ran her hand lightly over the back of one of the chairs. "It's a beautiful house, Ethan," she said. "You did well." He looked at her. "I worked a lot. I can see that." Annie wandered back into the living room and stopped in front of a large piano near the wall. "Do you play?" she asked. "I used to," he said. "A long time ago." "Why did you stop?" He thought about that for a moment. "I got busy, and then I got used to the house being quiet." Annie looked at the piano, then back at him. "Mama says when a house is too quiet, people start to feel sad and don't know why." Marissa gave a small laugh. "I did say that." Ethan nodded slowly. "She's right." They walked through the rest of the house together. The kitchen was large and bright, with a wide island in the middle and stools lined up along one side. Annie climbed onto one of the stools and spun slightly from side to side. "You could cook a lot of pancakes in here," she said. "I was thinking the same thing," Ethan replied. Marissa opened the refrigerator and looked inside. It was neat and mostly empty except for a few containers, juice, and neatly arranged groceries. "You really do live alone," she said quietly. "Yes." She closed the refrigerator door gently. "Ethan," she said, turning to face him. "This house, it's too big for one person." "I know," he said. They stood there for a moment, the three of them in the middle of a kitchen that looked like it belonged to a family that hadn't arrived yet. Annie slid off the stool and walked back into the living room. On a shelf near the stairs, she noticed a framed photograph. She picked it up carefully. It was an old picture of Ethan as a young man standing beside an older man, his father. Both of them were dressed formally, standing in front of a building, looking serious but proud. "Is this your dad?" she asked. Ethan walked over and looked at the photo. "Yes." Annie studied the picture, then looked at him. "He looks like you." "People used to say that," Ethan replied. Marissa stepped closer and looked at the photograph too. Her expression softened. "He would have been happy to see this house," she said. "He always wanted you to do something big." Ethan nodded. "He also wanted us to stay together." Marissa didn't answer that, but her eyes dropped slightly. Annie carefully put the photograph back where she found it. Then she turned and looked at Ethan with a very serious expression again. "Uncle Ethan," she said, trying the words slowly. "Why did you bring us here?" Ethan did not rush his answer. He walked to the large window and looked out over the yard for a moment before turning back to them. "Because I wanted you to see where I live," he said, "and because I wanted to ask you something. Both of you." Marissa crossed her arms slightly, not defensive, but preparing herself. "What is it?" Ethan took a breath. "I don't want to lose you again," he said simply. "I spent too many years not knowing where you were, not knowing if you were okay. I don't want to go back to that." Marissa looked down at the floor, then back at him. "Neither do I," she said quietly. He nodded once. "Then come live here," he said. The words were simple, but they filled the entire room. Annie looked from Ethan to her mother, her eyes wide but hopeful. Marissa did not speak right away. She walked slowly to the window and stood beside him, looking out at the yard the way he had a moment before. "Ethan," she said after a long silence, "this is your house, your life. I can't just walk into it and take up space." "You wouldn't be taking up space," he said. "You'd be filling it." She closed her eyes for a second, as if those words had gone somewhere deep. "I don't want you to feel like you owe us something," she said. "I don't," he replied. "I'm doing this because I want my family and my life, not somewhere across the city where I only see you once in a while. Here, where I can make breakfast for Annie before school, where we can have dinner at that table instead of me sitting there alone, where this house can finally sound like people live in it." Annie walked slowly toward them, listening to every word. Marissa turned to look at her daughter, then back at Ethan. "This would change everything," she said. "I know," he answered. Annie slipped her hand into her mother's. "Mama," she said softly, "I think this house is too lonely." Marissa looked down at her, then back at Ethan. The three of them stood there in the quiet kitchen, the late afternoon light coming through the windows, stretching across the floor between them like a line they were all being asked to cross. Finally, Marissa spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "If we come here," she said, "we come as family, not as guests." Ethan nodded immediately. "As family." Annie squeezed her mother's hand and smiled, just a little, and for the first time since he bought the house, Ethan felt like the empty rooms around him were finally waiting for something that might actually arrive. That evening, after they left Ethan's house, the car ride back to the apartment was quieter than the drive there. Annie sat in the back seat, looking out the window, but she wasn't really watching the streets. Her mind was still inside the big house on the hill, the long table, the piano, the wide windows, the empty rooms that echoed when you spoke. She tried to imagine what it would be like to wake up in a place like that, to eat breakfast in that big kitchen, to hear footsteps in hallways that were too quiet. In the front seat, Marissa sat with her hands folded in her lap. She hadn't said much since Ethan asked them to move in. She wasn't upset, and she wasn't happy either. She was thinking, weighing, remembering, and trying not to let her emotions make the decision for her. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, giving her time. When he parked in front of her building, he turned off the engine but didn't reach for the door right away. "You don't have to answer me tonight," he said. Marissa nodded. "I know. I meant what I said," he continued. "Not because I feel sorry for you. Not because I think you need help. I asked because you're my sister, and Annie is my niece, and I want my family close." Marissa looked at the dashboard for a long moment before speaking. "When we were kids," she said slowly, "I used to think you would grow up and live in a big house. I don't know why. I just thought you would." Ethan smiled faintly. "And did you think you'd be living there too?" She let out a small breath that was almost a laugh. "I thought we'd all still be in the same city at least." He nodded. "So did I." They sat in silence for a moment more. Then Annie leaned forward between the seats. "Can I say something?" she asked. "Of course," Ethan said. "I know it's a big house," she said carefully. "And I know it's your house. But when we were there, it didn't feel like we were visiting. It felt like the house was waiting." Neither Ethan nor Marissa spoke for a moment. Annie continued, trying to explain the feeling the way only a child could. "You know how when you go to school early and the classroom is empty, and it feels different than when everyone is there? That house felt like that. Like a place that's ready, but nobody's inside yet. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest when he heard that. Marissa turned slightly in her seat to look at Annie. "Sweetheart, moving into someone else's house is a big decision." "I know," Annie said, "but he's not someone else. He's you and him. Family." Marissa looked at Ethan again, and this time there was less hesitation in her eyes, but more fear. Not fear of him, fear of change. "I've lived in that apartment for a long time," she said quietly. "It's not much, but it's ours. Every corner of it is familiar. I know which window sticks in the winter. I know which cabinet you have to push twice to close. Annie grew up there." "I'm not trying to erase that," Ethan said gently. "I would never ask you to forget the life you built. I just want to give us a chance to build the next part together." She looked down at her hands again. "I'm not used to depending on anyone." "You wouldn't be depending on me," he said. "You'd be living with me. That's different." Annie opened the car door before either of them could say anything else. She stepped out, then turned back and leaned down to look at them. "If we don't try," she said, "we'll never know if it could have been good." Marissa stared at her for a moment. "You're too young to sound that wise," she said. Annie shrugged. "I just don't want us to be far away again now that we found each other." That sentence settled heavily in the car. Marissa closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked at Ethan. "Give me a little time," she said. "Not too long, just enough to think clearly." "Take all the time you need," he replied. That night, after Annie had gone to bed, Marissa sat alone at the small kitchen table with the old wallet in front of her. The apartment was quiet except for the faint sound of a television in another unit and the occasional car passing outside. She opened the wallet and looked at the photograph again. Her father in the chair, Ethan standing beside him, and herself, smiling, not knowing how quickly life could change. She ran her finger lightly over the plastic covering the photo. "We found each other," she whispered to the picture, as if her father could somehow hear her. "After all this time, we found each other." She thought about Ethan standing in that big, quiet house. She thought about Annie walking through those rooms, counting chairs at the table. She thought about the years in between, the years when she had carried that wallet from place to place, telling herself that family didn't disappear just because life got complicated. Now Ethan had come back into her life not as a memory, not as a story she told her daughter, but as a man standing in front of her offering a place in his home and in his life. She closed the wallet slowly. The next afternoon, Ethan returned again after school. Annie ran ahead of him up the apartment stairs and pushed the door open. "Mama, we're home," she called. Marissa walked out of the kitchen and looked at Ethan. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she took a small breath. "I've been thinking," she said. Ethan waited. "I don't want Annie to grow up thinking she has to do everything alone," Marissa continued. "I don't want her to think family is something that disappears and only exists in old photographs." Ethan said nothing, but his eyes never left her face. "So," she said, her voice steady now, "we'll come. Not because we need a big house, but because we found our family again. And I don't want to lose that a second time." For a moment, Ethan didn't move. Then he nodded once, slowly, as if he understood that this was not just a decision about where to live. It was a decision about trust, about forgiveness, about starting again from a place where something had once been broken. Annie looked from her mother to Ethan, then smiled. "So, we're going to live in the big lonely house," she said. Ethan smiled back at her. "It won't be lonely anymore." The decision, once spoken out loud, made everything feel suddenly real. They did not move that same day. Marissa insisted on taking a few days to organize their things, to speak to the landlord, to pack slowly and properly. She said she didn't want the move to feel like they were running away from a life, but walking carefully into a new one. Ethan respected that, so for the next few days, he found himself living a life he had never lived before, one that involved cardboard boxes, school schedules, grocery lists, and evening dinners at a small kitchen table instead of late meetings in silent rooms. On Saturday morning, he showed up early wearing jeans and a dark sweater instead of a suit. Annie opened the door before he could knock. "You're here," she said, as if she had been waiting by the door. "I said I would help you move," he replied. She nodded seriously. "Mama made a list." "Of course she did," he said. Inside, the apartment looked different already. A few boxes were stacked near the wall. Books were piled neatly on the table. The old wallet lay beside them, as if it had become something important again, not just an object, but a reminder of why all of this was happening. Marissa came out of the bedroom carrying folded towels. She stopped when she saw Ethan. "You don't have to carry everything," she said. "I know," he answered, "but I want to." They worked side by side for most of the morning. Ethan carried boxes down the narrow stairs and out to his car. Marissa packed kitchen items carefully in newspaper. Annie was in charge of putting labels on the boxes with a black marker. "This one says kitchen," she announced, sticking a label on a box almost as big as she was. "And this one says books. And this one says important stuff." Ethan paused when he heard that. "What's in the important stuff box?" Annie opened it to show him. Inside were photo albums, school papers, a small jewelry box, and the old leather wallet. "Mama said we always keep important things where we can find them," Annie said. Marissa glanced at the box and smiled faintly. "Some things you don't replace," she said. By the afternoon, most of the apartment was packed. The rooms looked bigger and stranger with the walls bare and the shelves empty. Annie stood in the middle of the living room and turned in a slow circle. "It looks different," she said. Marissa looked around too. "Every place looks different when you're about to leave it," she said quietly. Ethan watched her face and understood that this wasn't just a move. This was her saying goodbye to the life she had built on her own, the life where she had learned to be strong because she had no other choice. "You can keep the apartment for another month if you want," Ethan said, "so you don't feel rushed." She looked at him, surprised. "You'd do that?" "Yes," he said. "I don't want this to feel like you're being pushed." She nodded slowly. "Thank you." That evening, they drove back to Ethan's house with the first load of boxes. Annie held the important stuff box on her lap the entire ride, both arms wrapped around it like it was something alive. When they arrived, Ethan opened the front door and turned on the lights. The house looked the same as always, clean, quiet, perfectly arranged, but this time, when they carried boxes inside, the air felt different. Like the house understood something was changing. "Where should this go?" Marissa asked, holding a box labeled kitchen. "In the kitchen," Ethan said. "And you should decide where things go, not me." She looked at him. "Are you sure?" "Yes," he said. "If you're going to live here, it should feel like your home too." Annie carried the important stuff box into the living room and set it carefully on the coffee table. Then she walked around the house again. But this time she wasn't looking at it like a visitor. She was looking at it like someone trying to decide where things belonged. "Mama," she called, "can I have the room with the window that looks at the big tree?" Marissa looked at Ethan. "It's her room," Ethan said. "She can choose." Annie smiled so wide it changed her whole face. "Really? Really?" She ran upstairs to look again, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. But now the echo didn't sound lonely. It sounded alive. Marissa stood in the middle of the living room, holding a dish towel in her hands, looking around slowly. "I don't even know where to start," she said. Ethan picked up one of the boxes. "Start anywhere," he said. "We have time." She watched him for a moment as he carried the box into the kitchen and began opening cabinets, not like a guest trying to be careful, but like someone who was ready to share his space. "You're serious about this?" she said. "Yes. This isn't going to be temporary." "No," he said. "It isn't." She nodded once, then walked into the kitchen and started unpacking plates beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. They just worked, side by side, placing dishes into cabinets, folding towels into drawers, putting things where they made sense. After a while, Marissa said quietly, "You know, when we were kids, I used to think you would grow up and do something important." Ethan looked at her. "I did." She nodded. "Yes, you did. But I don't think this house is the most important thing you've done." He didn't answer right away. Upstairs, they could hear Annie walking from room to room, talking to herself as she decided where her books and drawings would go. Marissa placed the last plate in the cabinet and closed the door. "I think," she said softly, "finding each other again might be the most important thing." Ethan leaned against the counter and looked around the kitchen, the open boxes, the new dishes mixed with his old ones, the sound of a child moving around upstairs, his sister standing in the same room after years of absence. For the first time since he bought the house, it no longer felt like a place he owned. It felt like a place that was finally being lived in. The first night in the house did not feel real to Annie. Her room was bigger than the entire living room in the old apartment. The window beside her bed looked out over the big tree she had chosen, its branches moving slowly in the night wind. Ethan had helped her carry her books upstairs, and Marissa had made the bed with the same blanket Annie had always used, the blue one with the small white stars. That was important to Marissa. She wanted Annie to understand that even though the house was new, their life was not being replaced. It was only moving. Downstairs, Ethan stood in the kitchen, looking at two different sets of dishes now sitting in the cabinets. Some were his plain, heavy, expensive. Some were Marissa's simple, slightly worn, but clearly used by hands that cooked every day. Marissa walked in and saw him standing there. "You look like a man who doesn't know where anything is in his own kitchen," she said. Ethan gave a small smile. "I used to know where everything was. And now? Now I think I have to learn again." She nodded. "That's not a bad thing." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Marissa opened the refrigerator and started taking out food. "I'm making dinner," she said. "You don't have to." "I know," she replied, glancing at him. "But this is how I take care of people. So let me do it." He raised his hand slightly in surrender. "All right." Annie came downstairs a few minutes later, walking slowly as if she still couldn't believe the house was real. "Mama, my room echoes," she said. "That's because it's bigger," Marissa said. "We'll put more things in it. Curtains, a rug, your books. Then it won't echo so much." Annie nodded, then climbed onto one of the tall kitchen stools. "What are we eating?" "Spaghetti," Marissa said. Ethan leaned against the counter. "I can't remember the last time someone cooked spaghetti in this house." "Well," Marissa said, placing a pot on the stove, "that's about to change." While the pasta cooked, Annie found a piece of paper and a pencil and began drawing at the kitchen island. "What are you drawing?" Ethan asked. "A map," she said. "A map of what?" "A map of the house," she replied seriously, "so I don't get lost." Marissa laughed softly. "You're not going to get lost. It's a very big house," Annie insisted. "Big houses need maps." Ethan watched her draw lines and little squares on the paper. "Make sure you put the kitchen in the right place," he said. "That seems to be the most important room." "It is," Marissa said. "That's where people talk." After dinner, they didn't go to separate rooms right away. Instead, Annie brought her map into the living room and spread it out on the coffee table. Ethan sat on one side of the table, Annie on the other, and Marissa sat on the sofa behind them. "This is the living room," Annie said, pointing. "And this is the kitchen. And this is my room. And this is Mama's room. And this is your room." She looked up at Ethan. "And this is the piano room." "The piano room," Ethan repeated. "Yes," she said. "You should play again so the house has music." He looked at the piano across the room. "Maybe I will." Marissa watched the two of them, her expression thoughtful but peaceful. "You know," she said, "this is the first time in a long time I've sat in a living room and didn't feel like I had to worry about something." Ethan looked at her. "You don't have to worry here." She nodded slowly. "I think I'm starting to believe that." Later that night, after Annie had gone to bed, Ethan and Marissa sat at the dining table with 2 cups of coffee. The big table no longer looked too large now that 2 people were sitting at it. "Do you remember," Marissa said, "when we used to sit at the kitchen table with Dad, and he would ask us what we learned in school that day?" "I remember," Ethan said. "You always had long answers. I always had short ones. You always said, 'I learned the usual,'" she said, smiling. "And Dad would say, 'The usual is not an answer.'" They both laughed quietly. The laughter faded, and Marissa looked at him more seriously. "Ethan, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why didn't you ever sell this house and move somewhere smaller?" He thought about that for a moment. "Because I think a part of me always thought, maybe one day I wouldn't be alone in it." She looked at him for a long time after that, but she didn't say anything else. Upstairs, Annie lay in her new bed, looking at the ceiling. The house made different sounds than the apartment had: soft air moving through vents, wood settling, a faint echo of footsteps from faraway rooms. But for the first time in a long time, those sounds didn't make her feel nervous. They made her feel like she was inside something big and safe at the same time. She held the old wallet in her hands for a moment, looking again at the photograph inside. Then she whispered very softly, "We found him." She closed the wallet and placed it carefully in the drawer beside her bed, turned off the lamp, and went to sleep in a house that no longer felt lonely. The house began to change in small ways after that first week. Not in the way magazines showed before and after pictures, but in quieter ways, the kind you only noticed if you had lived in the silence before. A backpack now rested over one of the dining chairs. A pair of shoes sat by the door that did not belong to Ethan. A drawing of a big tree and a house with 3 stick figures was taped to the refrigerator with a magnet. On Monday morning, the kitchen was no longer quiet. Marissa stood at the stove making eggs while Annie sat at the counter finishing her homework. Ethan came downstairs in a white shirt with his tie still untied, stopping when he saw the two of them already in the kitchen. "For a moment," he said, "I thought I was in the wrong house." Marissa didn't turn around. "You're in the right house," she said. "You're just not the only one living in it anymore." Annie looked up from her notebook. "Uncle Ethan, do you know long division?" "I do," he said cautiously. "Why?" She turned the notebook toward him. "Because I don't like it." He set his briefcase down and walked over. "I don't think anyone likes long division," he said, looking at the page. "But I can show you a trick that makes it easier." Marissa watched them from the stove without saying anything, but there was a small smile on her face as she listened to Ethan explain math at 8 o'clock in the morning like it was the most normal thing in the world. After breakfast, they fell into a routine faster than any of them expected. Ethan drove Annie to school on his way to work. In the afternoons, Marissa had found a job at a small accounting office not far from the house, and Ethan arranged his schedule so he could pick Annie up most days. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after they moved in, Ethan arrived early at Annie's school. He stood near the front gate with other parents and grandparents, feeling slightly out of place in his work suit among people in work uniforms, jeans, and jackets. When the bell rang and the children came out, Annie spotted him quickly and ran over. "You're early," she said. "I finished work early," he replied. "I thought we could stop somewhere before going home." "Where?" "You'll see," he said. He drove them to a small music store a few blocks away. Annie looked confused as they walked inside. "Why are we here?" she asked. Ethan nodded toward a row of pianos against the wall. "Because you told me the house needs music." Her eyes widened. "This is for you?" "For us," he said. "But I thought maybe you might want to learn too." "I don't know how to play," she said. "Neither did I when I started," he replied. A gray-haired woman who worked at the store walked over and smiled at Annie. "Would you like to try?" she asked. Annie looked at Ethan. He nodded. She sat down on the piano bench and pressed one key very carefully. The note rang out, clear and bright. She smiled immediately. "It sounds like a bell." Ethan sat beside her and played a few simple notes, then showed her how to place her fingers. For the next 20 minutes, the two of them sat there, playing simple sounds that slowly began to turn into something that almost sounded like music. When they got home, Marissa was in the kitchen making dinner. Annie ran in first. "Mama, Uncle Ethan is going to teach me piano." Marissa looked at Ethan. "You're serious?" "Yes," he said. "She said the house needs music." "I think she's right." Marissa smiled and went back to stirring the pot on the stove. "Your grandfather used to play," she said. "Not well, but he loved it." "I remember," Ethan said. "He only knew 3 songs. And he played them over and over," she said, laughing softly. That night after dinner, Annie sat at the piano again, pressing keys slowly, trying to remember what Ethan had shown her. The notes were uneven and hesitant, but they filled the house in a way silence never could. Ethan stood in the doorway, listening. Marissa came to stand beside him. "You know what's strange?" she said quietly. "What?" "I used to worry all the time about money, about bills, about making sure Annie had what she needed. I thought those were the hardest things in life. And now?" he asked. "Now I think the hardest thing might be letting yourself be happy when you're not used to it," she said. Ethan looked at her, understanding exactly what she meant. "I don't want this to feel temporary," she continued. "I don't want Annie to feel like this can disappear." "It won't," he said firmly. "I told you. I'm not going anywhere." She studied his face, making sure he meant it. "Okay," she said quietly. "Then we won't either." Across the room, Annie played the same 3 notes again and again until they finally sounded right. Then she turned around on the bench. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan said. "I did." She grinned. That was a song. A very small one, but still a song. Ethan nodded. Every big song starts as a small one. Marissa looked between the two of them, her daughter at the piano, her brother standing in the doorway of a house that no longer felt empty, and she realized something she had not allowed herself to believe before. Some families are not broken forever. Some of them just take a long time to find their way back. A few weeks passed, and the house no longer felt new to Annie. It began to feel like a place where days had a shape. Morning breakfast at the kitchen counter. School runs with Ethan. Afternoons with homework at the big dining table. Evenings with Marissa cooking while Annie practiced piano and Ethan finished work in his study with the door open instead of closed. One evening, Annie sat at the piano, playing the small song she had been practicing for days. It was still slow, but now the notes connected, one after another, like careful steps across a stream. Ethan sat in a chair nearby, listening without interrupting. When she finished, she turned to look at him. "It sounds better now," she said. "It does," he replied. "You practiced." "Mama says practice is just another word for not giving up," Annie said. Marissa, who was in the kitchen, smiled when she heard that. "That's exactly what it means." Annie closed the piano lid gently and walked over to the table where her school bag lay. "We have a school program next month," she said. "They said some students can play music." Ethan looked at her. "Would you like to play?" She hesitated. "Maybe, but I'd be scared." "That's normal," he said. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means you try anyway." She nodded slowly, thinking about that. Later that night, after Annie went upstairs, Marissa found Ethan in his study. He was sitting at his desk, looking at some papers but not really reading them. "You're working less," she said, leaning against the doorframe. He looked up. "I am. Your company hasn't fallen apart yet?" she asked with a small smile. "Not yet," he said. "Turns out the world doesn't end if I leave the office before 8. She walked into the room and looked around. The study was neat, lined with books and awards, framed articles, and photographs of buildings and projects Ethan had worked on over the years. "You built a whole life," she said quietly. "So did you," he replied. She shook her head slightly. "I built a life where I was always trying to make sure the next bill was paid and Annie had what she needed. That was my project." "And you succeeded," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "You know what the strange part is?" "What?" "I don't feel like I moved into your house," she said. "I feel like we all moved into the same life at the same time." Ethan leaned back in his chair, thinking about that. "I think you're right," he said. A few days later, Annie came home from school quieter than usual. She put her bag down and sat at the kitchen table without saying much. Marissa noticed immediately. "What happened?" Annie shrugged. "Nothing." Ethan, who had just walked in behind her, recognized that tone. "Something happened," he said gently. "Do you want to tell us?" Annie looked down at her hands. "We have to write in class what our parents do for work," she said, "and where we live." Marissa pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "And that upset you?" Annie hesitated. "Some kids said I was lying." "Lying about what?" Ethan asked. "About the house," she said quietly. "And about you. They said people like me don't live in houses like that, and they said rich people don't have families like ours." The room went very still. Marissa's face changed slightly, a mix of hurt and anger, but she kept her voice calm. "What did you say?" "I said it was true," Annie replied, "but they didn't believe me." Ethan pulled out a chair and sat on the other side of her. "Annie," he said, "there are always going to be people who think they understand the world because of what they see on the outside. They see a house, or money, or the color of someone's skin, and they think they know the whole story." She looked up at him. "But they don't." "No," he said, "they don't." Marissa put her hand over Annie's. "What matters is not what they think. It's what you know is true." Annie was quiet for a moment. "I know you're my mama," she said, looking at Marissa. Then she looked at Ethan. "And I know you're my uncle. And I know we live together." "That's true." Ethan nodded. "That's true." She took a small breath. "Then I don't care if they believe me." Marissa smiled softly. "That's my girl." That night, Annie practiced the piano longer than usual. The notes were stronger now, more certain, filling the house and reaching into rooms that had once been silent. Ethan stood in the hallway listening again, and Marissa came to stand beside him. She's stronger than I was at her age, Marissa said quietly. Ethan shook his head. No, she's strong because she has you. Marissa didn't answer right away. Then she said something very softly, almost like she was saying it to herself. And now she has you too. In the living room, Annie played her small song again from the beginning. But this time she didn't stop when she made a mistake. She kept going, finishing the song all the way to the end. When she was done, she looked toward the hallway where she knew they were standing. Did you hear that? She called. Ethan answered, his voice warm and certain. Yes. And this time, you didn't stop. Annie smiled. I told you, practice means not giving up. And in that moment, the house that had once been too big, too quiet, and too empty was filled with something that had nothing to do with money or success. It was filled with a family that had found each other again, and was learning, day by day, how not to lose each other a second time. The school program was held on a Thursday evening, in the small auditorium with the wooden stage and rows of folding chairs that squeaked every time someone moved. Annie stood backstage with the other children, her hands clasped tightly together. She could hear the low hum of parents talking in the audience, the sound of programs rustling, the piano on stage as someone tested a few notes. I'm nervous, she whispered. Her teacher knelt beside her. That means you care, she said kindly. Just remember what we practiced. Slow and steady. Annie nodded, but her stomach still felt tight. Out in the audience, Marissa and Ethan sat in the third row. Marissa held the program in her hands but hadn't turned a page in several minutes. She'll be fine, Ethan said quietly. I know, Marissa replied. I'm just thinking about the first time she tried to play a note and didn't even know where to put her fingers. Ethan smiled slightly. Now she's playing in front of a room full of people. Marissa glanced at him. You did that. You brought music into that house. No, he said. She did. I just opened the piano. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Marissa said something she had been thinking about for a while. You know, when Annie told me what those kids at school said about people like us not living in houses like this, it made me realize something. What? Ethan asked. That the world still decides what a family is supposed to look like, she said. And if you don't match the picture, people get confused. Ethan nodded slowly. The world has always been confused about that. She looked at him. Does it bother you? He thought for a moment. It used to. When I was younger, I cared a lot about what people said. About reputation. About what looked right from the outside. But now, he paused, then shook his head slightly. Now I only care about what's true inside this house. Marissa looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Me too. On stage, the curtain opened and the program began. One by one, children walked out, some singing, some reading, some playing instruments. Some made mistakes and started again. Some rushed. Some froze and had to be helped by a teacher. Finally, Annie's name was called. Marissa's hand immediately found Ethan's arm and held on. Annie walked onto the stage in a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back neatly. She looked smaller up there than she did at home, but she walked to the piano bench without stopping. She sat down, placed her hands on the keys, then paused. From the audience, Ethan could see her take a small breath, just like he had taught her, slow, steady. Then she began to play. The song was simple, careful, not perfect, but the notes were clear, and she did not stop when her fingers hesitated for half a second in the middle. She kept going, just like she had practiced in the living room, just like she had promised herself she would. Marissa felt tears in her eyes before the song was even halfway through. Ethan sat very still, watching Annie's small hands move across the keys in the bright stage light. He remembered the first time she had touched a piano key in the store and said it sounded like a bell. Now those bell-like notes were filling an entire room. When she finished, there was a small pause, then applause filled the auditorium. Annie looked surprised for a second, then she smiled and stood up, giving a small, polite bow before walking off the stage. Marissa wiped her eyes. I can't believe how big she's getting, she whispered. Ethan didn't take his eyes off the stage curtain where Annie had disappeared. She was brave, he said quietly. After the program ended, they waited near the side of the stage. Children ran to their parents, holding flowers, programs, and small certificates. Annie spotted them and ran over. I didn't stop, she said immediately. You didn't, Ethan said. I'm very proud of you. You were right, she said. I was scared, but I did it anyway. Marissa hugged her tightly. "You were wonderful," she said. "Absolutely wonderful." Annie looked up at both of them. "Did you hear when I almost messed up in the middle?" Ethan nodded. "I did. I remembered what you said," she continued. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means you keep going." Ethan smiled. "That's exactly what it means." They walked out of the school together into the cool evening air. Parents and children passed by them, talking and laughing. The parking lot full of headlights and voices. As they reached the car, Annie slipped her hand into Ethan's on one side and Marissa's on the other. "Mama," she said, "do you think Grandpa would have liked the song?" Marissa smiled softly. "Yes," she said, "I think he would have liked it very much." Annie nodded, satisfied with that answer. They stood there for a moment between the car and the open night, the three of them under the yellow glow of the parking lot lights. Ethan looked at Annie, then at Marissa, and realized something he had not fully understood until that moment. Success, money, houses, business, none of those things had ever stood beside him in a parking lot holding his hand after a school concert. Family did that, and as they drove home together, Annie talking in the back seat about every single moment on the stage, Ethan realized that the life he had spent years building had only truly begun the day a little girl opened an old wallet in a small store and changed all of their lives. A few days after the school program, life settled into something that felt steady and real. Not perfect, not like the movies where everything changes overnight, but steady in the way mornings came with breakfast together, afternoons came with homework at the big table, and evenings came with music from the piano and Marissa's cooking filling the house with the kind of smells that made a place feel lived in. One Sunday afternoon, Annie sat on the floor in the living room with a box of old photographs Marissa had finally unpacked. The old leather wallet lay beside her, open, the familiar photograph still inside. "Uncle Ethan," she called, "come here. I found more pictures." Ethan walked over and sat down in the armchair while Annie spread the photos across the coffee table. "This was Mama when she was little," Annie said, holding up a picture. In the photo, Marissa was about 8 years old, standing in a yard with her hands on her hips, looking determined about something. Ethan laughed softly. "She used to make that exact face when she was about to argue with me." "I did not," Marissa said from the kitchen. "You absolutely did," Ethan replied. Annie picked up another photo. "Is this you?" Ethan leaned forward. It was an old picture of him as a teenager, sitting on the hood of an old car, looking serious and a little unsure of himself. "I looked like that," he said. "You looked like you were already worried about the future," Marissa said, walking in and drying her hands with a towel. "I probably was," he admitted. Annie looked at the photos for a long time, then said something quietly. "You were together in all these pictures." Marissa sat down beside her. "Yes," she said softly. "Before we got separated." Annie looked at the wallet, then at the photos, then at both of them. "I'm glad you kept the wallet," she said, "because if you didn't, we wouldn't have found each other." Marissa put an arm around her shoulders. "I think we would have found each other somehow," she said. Ethan shook his head slightly. "Maybe. But it might have taken another 20 years. Annie closed the wallet carefully and held it in both hands. "This is the most important wallet in the world," she said. Ethan smiled. "I think you might be right." That evening, after Annie went upstairs, Marissa and Ethan stayed in the living room, the old photographs still spread across the table. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we never found each other again?" Marissa asked quietly. "Yes," Ethan said. "I think I would have kept working, kept building things, kept telling myself I was too busy to notice the house was empty. And I would have kept working, paying bills, taking care of Annie," she said. "And I would have kept that wallet in a drawer and told her stories about a brother she might never meet." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them looking at the same photograph, the one from the wallet. "Life is strange," Marissa said finally. "You can lose someone for years, and then find them again because of something as small as a wallet." Ethan nodded. "Sometimes the smallest things are the ones that don't let you lose your way completely." She looked at him. "You know what Annie said to me last night?" "What?" She said, "Mama, I think Grandpa would be happy now because we're all back together." Ethan looked down at the photograph for a long time after that. "I hope so," he said quietly. A few minutes later, Annie's footsteps came down the stairs again. She walked into the living room holding something in her hand. "I made something," she said. "What is it?" Marissa asked. Annie handed the paper to Ethan. It was a drawing of a big house, a large tree, and 3 people standing in front of the house holding hands. Above them, she had drawn a small sun in the corner and written in careful letters, "A family that found each other." Ethan looked at the drawing for a long time without speaking. Marissa read the words and put her hand over her mouth, her eyes filling with tears again. But this time they were not tears of sadness. They were something else. Something like relief. Annie looked worried for a moment. "Is it bad?" she asked. Ethan shook his head and pulled her into a gentle hug. "No," he said quietly. "It's the most accurate drawing I've ever seen." Marissa sat beside them, and for a moment the three of them stayed there together in the living room, the big house no longer too big, the past no longer something painful and far away, the future no longer something they had to face alone. After a while, Annie said sleepily, "I'm glad you asked me about the wallet." Ethan smiled. "I'm glad you answered." She leaned her head against his arm. "That was the most important question you ever asked." Ethan looked at Marissa, then at the old wallet on the table, then at the drawing in his hand. "Yes," he said softly, "it was. This story carries a quiet but powerful lesson. Sometimes family is not lost, only separated by time, distance, and the mistakes of life. Money, success, and big houses cannot replace people who belong in your life. What truly makes a house a home is not furniture, walls, or wealth. It is laughter in the kitchen, footsteps in the hallway, and someone waiting for you at the end of the day. The story reminds us that kindness, loyalty, and love can reconnect what the world once pulled apart. And sometimes, it only takes one small moment, one question, one memory, one old wallet to bring a family back together. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.